So we are rolling through these terms. This is the final installment of the terms as they relate to the skeletal system in this intro mini course. And then we'll move on to the nitty-gritty details when we talk about the different regions of the skeletal system, including the axial skeleton, the upper limb skeleton, and the lower limb skeleton. But let's go ahead and get the final installment of these terms. So today, in this particular video, we'll talk about flexion and extension, abduction and adduction. So notice that I've emphasized the letter B when I say abduction because abduction and adduction sound pretty similar. And then we'll talk about circumduction briefly. So let's define flexion and extension first. So flexion is movement of a body part forward or decreasing the angle of a joint. And so whether it's movement forward or decreasing the angle of a joint depends on which joint we're referring to. So shoulder flexion is actually movement of the shoulder forward, or humerus technically forward. Elbow flexion actually is decreasing the angle of a joint. We can flex our hip, and that's actually the movement forward as opposed to changing the angle of a joint. And then knee flexion is actually decreasing the angle of a joint, in this case at the knee. Extension is the opposite. It's movement of a body part backward or increasing the angle of a joint. Shoulder extension would be movement at the shoulder backward. Elbow extension is increasing the angle of the joint back toward a greater angle, essentially. Hip extension, movement of the at the hip backward, and then knee extension is basically making the knee straight, the knee joint straight. So I'm not a classically trained artist. I like to rely on lines and arrows to describe anatomic principles, and they also come in handy for physiological principles as well. So if you're in the classroom with me, you'd realize right away this dude is not an artist. So let's go ahead and look at this easy diagram to describe flexion. So I've shown the elbow there with a blue circle, and the arm is shown by a black line, and then we have the forearm shown by another black line. So essentially this is your elbow joint partially flexed, like your elbows to your side and partially flexed or halfway flexed towards your arm, and you're holding a weight, for example. So flexion is going to be movement of the forearm toward the arm, as indicated by the blue arrow. So this is the result of that flexion that occurs at the elbow. So your forearm is closer to your arm at this point. You haven't flexed all the way, but you've moved your forearm closer to your arm, so you've decreased the angle of that joint, basically at the elbow joint. Then we can extend. So that is basically taking us back to where we were before. We're moving the forearm back away from the arm, and then we have back to the starting position. But we can fully extend, right? And so that is moving the forearm away from this 90-degree angle, and so we're fully extended at the elbow. And so there's the result of full extension. And so that's basically when your arm is to your side, and it's completely straight, full extension. So there is shoulder flexion and also shoulder extension too. As this person uses this battle rope, movement occurs at the shoulder forward. So that is shoulder flexion. Basically, this person with the battle rope is mostly doing shoulder flexion with some minimal shoulder extension too, but mostly flexion in this case. So this is hip flexion and knee flexion as this person does some box jumps. Your movement forward at the hip, and then knee flexion so that they can get on top of the box. And so you're decreasing the angle of the knee joint when you try to step onto this or jump onto this box. So the cyclist here, we have hip flexion or movement at the hip forward, and we have knee flexion in this case as well. So decreasing the angle of the knee joint. There is knee extension. So just like elbow, full extension at the elbow, we have a straightening occurring here with extension. There's shoulder extension, movement of the shoulder backward or toward the back. When we talk about abduction, movement, this is movement of a body part away from the body. So we can have some examples of this. This is movement of the upper limb away from the body. We can move the lower limb away from the body. That is also abduction. Spreading the fingers apart is abduction. So let me just key in on the upper limb example. You may have heard of the muscle called deltoid, and the deltoid muscle is responsible for basically it attaches to the proximal part or midway of our humerus, and when it contracts, it's pulling our humerus away from midline, which is known as abduction. There is abduction, pulling the arm away from midline. Adduction then is movement of a body part toward the body. So basically you're bringing the upper limb back toward midline or toward the body. You're basically adding it back to the body, so to speak. Same thing with the lower limb, or you can talk about it related to the fingers. You're bringing the fingers together. So in this case, adduction would be simply just bringing the entire upper limb back toward midline or toward the body and adding it back to the body, so to speak. So then circumduction is basically a movement that combines flexion, extension, abduction, and adduction all together. So right now you can think arm circles, and you can just do some arm circles right now. And that is circumduction. It's basically just a combination of these various movements. And so you can do this really well, of course, at the shoulder joint. So today we talked about flexion and extension, abduction and adduction, and circumduction. And so the reason these terms are helpful is because when we talk about the different skeletal structures, we need to describe the movements that occur when they link up and form joints with one another, or they articulate with each other. So we'll talk about how the humerus links up with the scapula, how the humerus also then links up with the ulna and radius at the elbow. And so we'll need to describe what occurs when they link up with each other. So in the next video, what I'll do is I'll introduce the nitty-gritty details for the upper limb. So we'll talk about the different bones, what they're called, which ones link up with the other ones, and then the movements that occur when these different bones form joints with one another. So in the interim, feel free to head over to anatomyonthego.com and use the resources that I've created for you to help you to learn the skeletal system, among other things. And I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.